G'day everyone. We're turning back to Australia, but we're actually contemplating and going to be discussing an issue which is huge, particularly across the West, and that's around education and our children, and particularly the forces, for want of a better word, that are at work trying to influence the young people. And so I'm delighted to bring on to the show Dr. Kevin Donnelly AM, which means that he is a member of the Order of Australia, for all you Kiwis wondering what that means. Dr. Donnelly, or Kevin if I might, welcome to the show.
No, always a pleasure, Simon. Thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
Oh, look, I've followed your work for years. You're a prolific author. Obviously, you've written recently Wake Up to Woke, The Culture of Freedom, a few years ago, and you were telling me just before we came on that you've got, at least as an article or a chapter in Defend the West, The Culture of Freedom. And just so viewers understand too, Kevin has a very deep experience, obviously with a PhD into the area of education. He's a cultural and political, if you will, commentator, well sought after. So Kevin, I'm just delighted you've made the time today.
Always a pleasure, and the issues, as you know, are so important, and it's vital that parents and teachers and young people in general understand what's been happening across mainly the West, whether it's England, America, Australia, New Zealand. This battle of ideas, as John Howard called it, is something that we all need to get involved in.
Absolutely, and I think certainly in the New Zealand area, it doesn't matter if it's education, and, if you will, specifically, or wider trends amongst our young people. It is a massive battle, and if I might put it incredibly simply and crudely, a lot of parents, and if you will, the more traditional mindset's been pushed to the outer, with the state and other actors trying to play more and more of a role. But I wonder if we start with something really specific, and then obviously widen out. But I'm aware you've been commenting recently on a rainbow toolkit that, as I understand it, some within the state of Victoria there in Australia have been trying to implement. Is it in schools or libraries? But I just wonder if you just tell us a little bit about that, because I think it begins to situate this conversation in something quite concrete and specific.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, this toolkit is simply the most recent attempt by the Labor government in Victoria to really impose a radical gender and sexuality agenda on young people, as young as kindergarten, certainly primary and secondary school. And that began some years ago with what was called the Safe Schools program, which we can talk about as well. But the toolkit is going into libraries around Victoria, and it's to acknowledge and celebrate, and it's a bit of a mouthful, but the LGBTIQA+. I mean, when I grew up, we knew that there were gays and lesbians, and frankly, I have no issue with that, in the sense that if young people in particular see that that's how they identify, well, I might disagree with it, but I don't think they should be unfairly treated. But what's happened, we now have this whole rainbow alliance, if you like, of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, asexual plus, because there's always a new category every second week. It's going into libraries. The problem there is, and I've had parents email me and phone me, it's really unfair. Young people, 8, 10, 12-year-old in particular, children, don't have the maturity to cope with what's being put in front of them. Now, whether it's about transitioning, arguing that boys can be girls, girls can be boys, the argument from what I call the cultural left, that gender and sexuality are not God-given or not biologically determined. They're a social construct. So they're fluid, dynamic. They're teaching young kids, as I said, 6, 8, 10 years old, that they can self-identify anywhere on this spectrum. And it's going into schools and universities and even now libraries. And it's part of a concerted campaign, I'd argue, by what I call the cultural left, to really overturn the concept of male and female. And if you like, we can talk a bit further about this. It goes back to Wilhelm Reich, a Marxist who wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution, I think 1951. And he argued the way to overthrow the status quo, the way to abolish capitalism, was to start with the family, the nuclear family, mother, father, children. What the cultural left want to do is to overturn that because they see it as something conservative.
Well, as Edmund Burke referred to it, it's the little platoon. The family's a little platoon. And it says me, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, firstly, familiar with Reich and his writings, but I've often argued, as I have in recent days, actually, speaking to some youth, that the thing around I'll just talk about too, cultural Marxism, it revolts or seeks revolution against all and everything. And so it revolts against the capitalist system and family. It wants to rip everything apart, and it's highly destructive, as you know. But I mean, how would you react then to the counterpoint? And by the way, I don't buy into it, but we at all. But some who say, yeah, we're allowed to teach these things to children because you and I and others are teaching a different construct.
Well, number one, I think children aged 8 or 10 or 12, they're just far too young, and they don't have the maturity or the experience of life to be able to make that decision. And in Victoria, it's even worse because the Labor government has legislated that if a parent, a priest, a rabbi, a counsellor, a doctor advises a young child that stop, this might not be what you want, here are the arguments for and against, they can be put in jail or fined. So parents are in trouble here in Victoria because if they counsel their child against transitioning, for example, they can be in trouble. Now, a lot of young people don't have the maturity or the intelligence, frankly. The other point here is that Ros Ward, who an academic, and she's a lesbian, fine, she's also a Marxist. Now, this is where we get into trouble. She helped develop the Safe Schools program that was funded by Labor and Liberal state and federal governments over the last 20 years, went into hundreds of schools around Australia. She argued at a socialist forum that the Safe Schools program was not about stopping bullying for gay, lesbian people. She argued it was about bringing about a socialist transformation where society could be turned upside down, where there was no sense of family. She actually said this publicly, that it's not about supporting young people or helping young people. It's a radical attempt to bring about what she saw as a socialist utopia. And obviously we know that's never worked in history. You only have to look at Pol Pot in Cambodia, Stalin in Russia, Mao in China. Millions and millions starved, tortured, killed. So this idea of a socialist utopia is just a figment of her imagination. But the danger is now, and we see this in the UK and Europe, governments and health departments have finally realised that this is dangerous, and they're now legislating against giving young people puberty blockers, letting them undergo surgery. So the pendulum is now swinging away from this cultural left idea about transitioning and self-identifying. In England in particular, they're now arguing that young people don't have the maturity to cope. So we must step back from doing this.
Unfortunately, as we speak, New Zealand's very much behind the 8 ball. Our Ministry of Health in particular, Kevin, is quite captured around the issue of puberty blockers, even though they've read the same medical documentation from the likes of Hilary Cass and others. They don't seem to read it like the rest of the world or we do. We have our very radical Green Party here who are advocating not just, and get this, the use of puberty blockers, but that free, unrestricted access. And it's like, oh, wow. I mean, gosh, says me with all my political bias or background. It's like, well, if you're going to deploy them, and one shouldn't, I think, but if you're going to, there has to be some sort of guardrails, but they're not even wanting that. And again, I think it's this very far left socialist attempt to, again, revolt or change the entire system. And if I might, it's what I said to these 400 young people on the weekend. Over 100 million people were killed seeking the last communist utopia since the Russian Revolution.
That's right.
100 million people. But I mean, if someone like that activist speaks out so profoundly, or not profoundly, so it's the wrong word, so openly? Do they think they're winning? Are they not afraid of the pushback?
Well, definitely. And, you know, I'm a great fan of T.S. Eliot, and he argues cultures do change and evolve. So we're not permanent in a sense that you only have to look at ancient Rome, what happened to that empire. The British Empire, for example, when I was a young boy at school, our map of the world, the sun never set in the British Empire. Now that's changed significantly over the years. So cultures do evolve. T.S. Eliot makes the point as well that if you lose a sense of religion, and he doesn't just mean Christianity, he means a sense of a moral basis for society, a spiritual, an ethical basis. If you lose that moral and religious and spiritual sense, then the culture is in trouble. Now, in Western culture, one of the things, obviously, and it goes right back to the French Revolution all those years ago, is that what the cultural left, as I call it, want to achieve is to deny religion, get rid of Christianity in Western countries like Australia, enforce this absolutist secular approach, whereas I say a priest cannot counsel a young boy or girl not to transition. So this campaign, if you like, from the socialist left or the cultural left, they've had so many victories, frankly, over the last 20, 30 years that they no longer hide what it is they're trying to do. And I think the pendulum is starting to move back. And I'm not a big fan of President Trump. I think some of what he does is wrong and he can be quite dangerous. But one of the most successful campaign strategies he had was that to address this idea of cultural Marxism, especially in places like Florida, you might know, I'm sure you do, that a lot of parents orchestrated a campaign to get into schools, to take over the ownership or the governorship of those schools. And one reason why DeSantis was elected originally, was because of this campaign by parents against cultural Marxism, especially gender and sexuality. So the short answer to your question is that the pendulum moves so far, I think, to the left that they no longer were worried about being public. But since then, it's become so, I would say, pernicious and almost evil that a lot of parents and teachers and others now are fighting back. So I just hope, there was that referendum in Ireland where they reaffirmed the idea of a mother staying at home, being a mother and a housewife, and that the government shouldn't make every woman be part of the paid workforce. I mean, you saw in America the swing to Trump. You saw in Australia a 60-40 vote against the Indigenous voice to Parliament. So I think the pendulum's starting to move. I'm not sure whether that's happening in New Zealand quite yet.
No, dare I admit it, and I hate to admit this to an Australian, but we're a bit behind here in New Zealand. We have a lot of these effectively conversion therapy, it's called here, where again, priests, pastors, doctors, psychologists, parents are not able to have conversations other than to affirm. I was one of only, I think, 8 MPs out of 120 who voted against it. And already, Kevin, we're seeing activists from this neo-Marxist left-wing socialist group misuse such legislation. Personally, I think it's bad right through, but they're using it that anyone who resists in any way is ipso facto trying to convert. So they're already using it to silence. And the other thing I thought I should pick up on is you mentioned safe schools, and we've had that in New Zealand since 2020 as well. The legislation was changed under a different government that said schools have to be safe places. And again, being a good conservative, I oppose that. Because again, what do you mean, well, not you, but what do they mean by safe? And I suspect it echoes what you're going through in Australia, because safe now means emotional, not just from physical harm, but people aren't to hear ideas or pushback which could unsettle them in any way.
again, you're correct. I mean, people talk about identity politics, about victimhood. Our universities, and I'm sure it's the same in New Zealand, there are trigger warnings. So if you read Macbeth, you have to be warned that somebody dies, that there's blood, that there's violence, that Lady Macbeth commits suicide. I mean, we have trigger warnings, we have safe spaces, we have diversity toolkits just to make sure that nobody's offended. Uh, and as you say, and I've written about this, when I went to school many years ago and did year 12 matriculation, we were taught clear thinking. So the idea was to weigh the argument in a balanced, objective, impartial way. Was it logical? Was it rational? Was it a generalization? We were always told never attack the person. Uh, what we now have, we've had generations of young people go through school and university where instead of I think, therefore I am, it's I feel, therefore I must be right. And I've seen young 12, 14-year-old girls crying on what we have here, the school strike for climate, where they ask young people to go on strike, wag school. I've seen young girls crying, and when they were asked why, they've said, the world's about to end, we'll never be able to have babies. So it's got to that stage now, and this is a broader question, and it gets to what Geoffrey Blainey calls, the great historian, a black armband view of Western culture, of Western civilization, of Australian history in particular. But as young people go through primary, secondary, tertiary now, it's a very bleak, nihilistic view of the world and of interrelationships and how they fulfill themselves, how they find happiness. And I mean, it was very different when I went to school. And one of the
Different from when I
things,
went through.
one of the things about Christianity, as I'm sure a lot of your viewers would appreciate, if you look at the Stations of the Cross and what Jesus taught in terms of the New Testament, there is a sense that there is something worthwhile, there is something valuable. There is evil in the world. There are people who are dangerous. I mean, fate can be a terrible thing, whether a friend is killed in a car accident, whether somebody overdoses, whether somebody commits suicide. But for many years now, young people have not been taught that resilience, that sense of there being a higher hope or goodness that you can get. Well, in fact, it would assuage the fear and the sense of negativity. So there are lots of issues there, but one in particular I'm keen on. I reviewed the national curriculum, co-chaired that review some years ago, and when I looked at the history curriculum in particular, but also literature, music, art, there were hundreds of references to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, history, spirituality. There were 5 references to Christianity in every subject from foundation to year 10. And students could go through schooling without any knowledge of ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece. So they had no basis of understanding for what underpins Western culture, and I include New Zealand in that as a Western liberal democracy. So that's the other problem here. It's not just gender and sexuality. It's the fact that young people are no longer taught a sense of national pride, a sense of stability and cohesion, and being part of a culture, a Western culture, which for all its faults is probably one of the best in the world.
What is it? I mean, we're going through the same thing. We talk about decolonization here. I'm sure it's part of the narrative over there as well, that anything to do with the West. So in the education space, the activists, the woke activists, Kevin, are raging that Shakespeare has been reaffirmed in our teaching curriculum. Western political systems, including democracy, freedom of speech, liberal values, are an imposition. Christianity is foreign. We have to re-embrace paganism. I mean, how is it that we've ended up with people who live and are educated within the West have become so hate-filled. God, I hate that phrase because it's so ubiquitous these days, but a deep disdain for the very society which gives them the freedoms that they enjoy.
Yeah, I mentioned before Michael Gove, who was the Secretary of State for Education under the Conservative government some years ago. He wrote a very good book where he talks about the culture wars, as they're called. And I suppose I'm an example. There are many people my age who went through university during the late 60s, the early 70s, and that was a time of the Cultural Revolution more broadly across Western countries. Now, a lot of it was philosophical in terms of debates, especially in France, people like Althusser, Bourdieu, Foucault, but also a lot of it was young people rebelling against authority. Now, whether it was Woodstock, the festival, where people sang about revolution, about overthrowing capitalism, about free love, about drugs. This was a time of LSD, of mescaline, of marijuana. Some of my friends in Australia went on what we call the hippie trail
All right.
across to India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, ended up in London. But there was a hippie trail. And, there was a Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The Beatles went to Rishikesh in India where they learnt meditation. So the 60s, and actually I did that as well, went to Rishikesh. The 60s was a time of great cultural upheaval. And a lot of those young people then went on to become bureaucrats, politicians, work in the media, teachers, academics, and they were imbued with what some people call the Kool-Aid, but they were imbued with this kind of fervour, and that's why they were very keen to make such radical change. The other point here is that, and I don't want to be too sinister, but one of the things Lenin and out of Russia, one of the things they knew, and this gets back to the Frankfurt School in Germany, was that in the West, the workers would never take to the barricades. There was never going to be a violent revolution in the West. So the way to achieve that revolution is to take the long march through the institutions. And that was a phrase Rudi Dutschke, the German activist, used. And it's based on Althusser's idea of the ideological state apparatus. And he argued that capitalism, the bourgeoisie, can dominate and control through violence, through guns, through torture, or they can control and dominate through ideology, the ideological state apparatus. Schools, universities, the church, family, intermediate organisations. Now, a lot of people took that very seriously, especially academics. And there was a good example maybe 3 or 4 years ago now where there was a philanthropist, Ramsay, who put a lot of money into establishing centres for Western civilization in universities around Australia. And Sydney University was one. There were many others, where over 100 academics said, we will not take the money. We must not take the money because to teach Western culture, Western civilization, is white supremacy. It's Eurocentric. And it gets back to what you were talking about, post-colonial theory, which goes back to, and I'm amazed, and you probably would be as well, there's a university in England where they argue even the Enlightenment, if you're talking about science, Western science, that is guilty of imperialism and it can't be taught. So you can't teach going back, to Socrates or well, he's a playwright, but you can't go back to Aristotle, Plato,
Yep.
And
we've got all that here.
Science
We actually
is a post, you know as well as I do.
Yeah, well, we had a couple of years ago, I've lost track of whether it was 2 or 4 years ago, we had 7 very esteemed academics, all fellows of the Royal Society, who were writing about science. And first and foremost, Kevin, saying there isn't Western science or whatever. It's just science. And they were reacting against the push in New Zealand, which has continued around something called Mataranga Mara, sort of indigenous ways of knowing. And they're saying, well, long and short, observational knowledge through indigenous knowing is fine, but it's not science. Well, literally hundreds and hundreds of their academic colleagues wrote an open letter condemning them for even mentioning the idea, which offended me at least two levels. One is science, and we've managed to get out of the dung heap thanks to the Enlightenment. And secondly, the reaction of academics against their own, the ability you would think of universities to explore ideas was being shut down. It was purely monological, and it's quite scary, really, again, for the way where we've got as a society now. And here in New Zealand, Kevin, they are fighting very hard, as you say. If you try to push back saying, well, science is science, that actually just because something comes out of a colonial form of power like England doesn't invalidate it. But there's a huge push to remove, as I say, everything from Shakespeare to any element of teaching English history, for example, is to be gotten rid of completely.
It's an infection, which really, it's infected so much. I mean, one of the examples in the national curriculum here is that they now talk about Indigenous algebra and Aboriginal or Indigenous science. I went to Sydney a couple of weeks ago and spoke at a forum. I said, and I shouldn't have been so rude, but I said, I didn't fly here on a boomerang. I flew here on an aeroplane. And the aeroplane stays in the air because of Western science, whether it's physics or mathematics or whatever it might be. The West has, in fact, put a man on the moon. We've had open heart surgery, just to name a few. And if you go back in history, the hundreds of thousands of people who died during the Black Plague, bubonic plague, I mean, it's Western science and medicine which has overcome that. The other point I will make, and I mentioned Wilhelm Reich, another Marxist academic that goes back to the Frankfurt School is Marcuse. And Marcuse argued in an essay about intolerance and tolerance that it was okay for the cultural left to be intolerant. You can cancel people, you can deceive people, you can misinform people, you can use any strategy you want to win the argument and to silence people, because Marcuse argued the current status quo in the West, the idea of objectivity, of impartiality in universities, the idea of truth, he argued they were all vehicles or instruments to dominate and oppress. So to achieve the revolution, it's okay to lie, deceive, cancel. And you might know how tragic that's been. Not the right word, but how debilitating and evil that's been, in the sense that good people can lose their jobs. They're not peer reviewed. They can't get published. They're not promoted. They're cancelled. And Camille Paglia, an American, and I think she's great value. She's getting a bit older now, but still very keen to argue the case. She argued some years ago that we're now living in an age of intolerance. And Orwellian, and I write a lot about 1984, Orwellian language control, mind control, groupthink. And I'll give you one example in Victoria where Daniel Andrews, the Premier, and again, I don't want to offend people, but I call him Dictator Dan.
Oh, he's terrible. You go for it. He's terrible.
He used every strategy out of 1984 to lock Victoria down for over 2 years. You couldn't leave your home. I couldn't go to the local Victoria market where I wanted to shop. You couldn't go to hospital if your parent or son or daughter was dying of some illness. You couldn't go to a funeral. But what Daniel Andrews did, and it's a bit like out of Orwell, freedom is slavery, war is peace. He argued if you're locked up, keeping us apart brings us together. Now, it's straight out of Orwell. How can you stay apart and be together?
Yep.
You can't. It's what's called cognitive dissonance, or what Orwell calls doublethink. And it just astounds me that people accepted that. And,
it's very familiar, Kevin, to New Zealanders under Jacinda Ardern, the then Labour government. Very much the same. Firstly, what you just described around what happened, I have to say, as a constituent MP, it was heartbreaking, story after story. So say a loved one would die, no funeral, you just had to stand inside your house and watch the hearse drive by, and many other horrendous examples. But that Orwellian doublespeak was exceptionally present, and we still have that now in a whole number of ways. I mean, can you just, if you don't mind, it's probably my philosophical enjoyment, but delve into this language control element, because it is so critical, I think, to understanding how the woke operate. They usurp words and twist them. So even things like diversity and inclusion, in themselves, we go, those are good words, but they, I would say, have been, as they usurped, warped, and now misused.
I mentioned George Orwell, 1984, and Orwell makes the point that if there's a relationship between language and thought, and he argued very strongly that language can control the way you think. So it's very important to realise that the language we use, the dialogue, how we interact verbally, or even in writing, the language we use. And that's why in Big Brother, this idea of double think or wrong think, it was enforced by the thought police. And I taught English for many years in secondary school, and it's been there. It's not just Orwell saying this. I mean, for many years now, people have been worried about the debasement of the English language, so that people no longer think with the clarity and the logic that they once did, because words, the meaning of words, have become, I would say, very much coloured by this cultural Marxist perspective. So when you talk about freedom, it's a good example. I mean, to be empowered, to be free, is a worthwhile thing. Nobody wants tyranny or injustice. But now that's been defined, freedom, in terms of identity politics, victimhood, that there are these groups that must be empowered, even though they're often a minority. And they must be empowered and given the right to achieve whatever they want to achieve. And anybody who criticises or doesn't agree with that is punished. So freedom used to be a balance between freedom and responsibilities and obligations. I mean, another one is obviously, an obvious one is gender or sexuality. And it's interesting, when I went to school, not that I was very good at French, but gender was a grammatical term referring to language. Because of actually, he was a New Zealander, Dr. I've forgotten his first name, Money, who went to America. He was the first one to introduce the idea of gender transitioning. And because of him, and this is probably a good 30, 40 years ago, gender became, the word no longer meant a grammatical term. It referred to the cultural left radical gender ideology, where it was fluid and dynamic. So, and you know, one thing, I was talking to my daughter when she was a lot younger, we saw The Wizard of Oz and Somewhere Over the Rainbow. I mean, the rainbow was like a symbol of something, I think, quite aesthetic, quite beautiful, quite appealing. But now when you talk about the Rainbow Alliance, it's actually a far left radical group of different people coming together. So even something like the rainbow has now been subverted. Certainly women. You might remember there was a woman in a pub, I think, in England, who walked into a pub with a T-shirt saying, "Woman, I am a woman, defined." And she wasn't allowed into the pub.
We had protest here a couple of years ago. A woman called Posey Parker turned up to speak about what it is to be a woman in the biological sense. Supported by mainstream media, the activists were whipped into a frenzy. Our police stood back, by the way, Kevin, as she and other women, particularly older women, were assaulted, and nothing happened. And so you see not only the violence in words, but we now see the physicality or the physical violence to ensure that this, if you will, Orwellian doublespeak, this new, the march through the institutions is absolutely held, because they, as you know better than I do, it doesn't stand up to rigor. It doesn't stand up to academic critique. And so they
No,
just become violent.
it's not supposed to. I remember many years ago at La Trobe University, a feminist academic saying being rational, it's a binary, Eurocentric, patriarchal concept. And being binary or rational and thinking in terms of right and wrong, that we can't do that. That's only used to oppress women. The other example Australia's going through, as I'm sure you're aware, is the horrific rise of anti-Semitism, and the fact that in Melbourne, Jews are frightened to go out on the street in some suburbs. They're frightened for their children going to a Jewish school. A synagogue was torched. And one of the things that struck me, there were university students demonstrating in Sydney and Melbourne, and they had flat banners saying, gay lesbians for Palestine. And you stop and think, well, hold on. How are gays and lesbians treated in Iran or Iraq or in Saudi Arabia? How do these Islamic countries treat people who are gender diverse? Well, they're put in jail, they're oppressed, some are physically assaulted. But you had this banner where gay lesbians support Gaza. And you think, well, that's just totally contradictory. But it gets back to that idea of cognitive dissonance. If logic and rationality are only Eurocentric, patriarchal, binary constructs, then you can virtually do anything. And that's why war is peace, freedom is slavery. Being apart brings us together. So that's what terrifies me. And in our schools now, and I'll change the subject, the last 3 years I've had forums for parents and teachers around Australia, starting classical liberal schools committed to an education which is academically rigorous, morally grounded, and emotionally and spiritually fulfilling. So a lot of teachers and parents are saying enough is enough. And they're starting up their own schools in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, all over Australia. That's small. People are lighting small fires, but I think it will only grow.
I
Sorry,
tend to agree.
Upsurgence in homeschooling as well.
We're seeing the same things here. We have the same weird alliance of groups fighting for the latest social justice cause. And we've had the same, I think it's called Queers for Palestine here, which I've always sort of thought it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. But I've forgotten who the authors were. I think it was in the 1950s, who basically say you take one social justice movement and you attach it to another. And, in those days it was around the sort of the gay liberation, linked itself to the black civil rights. And we've just seen that continue now. But I do wonder, and it probably takes us down a rabbit hole we don't need to go down, but I think this cognitive dissonance is part of why a lot of these activists are miserable and lost. Because I think deep down in one's, conscience, for want of a better term, they sort of know something's not quite right, but it fuels their identity for the time. But in the education space, we here in New Zealand are seeing more people homeschooling. In fact, my wife and I were just at a new developing school which is all about classical education. We're influenced because friends of ours in the States have set one up, again, grounded in good classical, sort of the trivium. People can look that up. Kevin and I know what it is, but the trivium, again, well-grounded, Christian. And and a sense of parental, can I just sort of, as we begin to wrap up, parental responsibility, because I don't know about you, you're the expert, Kim, but one of the things I notice in a lot of these discussions, particularly in education, is a strong desire by these activists to disempower parents. Parents are not to know about the transition of their child or the pronouns of the child. Parents are not allowed to ask what's in the curriculum and so forth. I mean, is that something you are seeing hand in hand with this activism?
It is, but before I get into that, just very quickly, I'm sure you're aware of Solzhenitsyn,
Oh, yes.
and he gave a lecture some years ago where he said, if you look at the two world wars, if you look at the rise of communism, what happened is people forgot God, and that gets back to what T.S. Eliot talks about in terms of once a culture denies the existence of something more absolute, a sense of truth, of beauty, of justice, of a more spiritual sense, then what do you draw on? And it staggers me that Australia, among young people, has one of the highest rates of anxiety, depression, and self-harm. Young people, if they're not grounded in anything more substantial, intellectually, morally, spiritually, then what do you turn to? And unfortunately, whether that's joining the revolution or whether it's taking drugs or whether it's becoming anxious and depressed, we're seeing that increasingly evidence of that. The other point about
Same here.
parents, it's again, it happened under Labor and Liberal governments, federally and state. One of the resources for, say, schools, explicitly tells schools they need not tell a parent. The parent need not be told if their child wants to transition or to change their pronoun. Now, that happened in America, and that's why there was this rebellion against it by so many people. It's, starting to happen here. There's a fabulous group of mothers in Adelaide, and I spoke to over 400 of them last year, called the Mummy Bears. I think they got that from America.
The what? Sorry, the mummy bears.
Bears, yeah, as in mummy
Love
bears.
it.
Watch out. Watch out. And they're campaigning against not just gender fluidity in schools, but also the overt sexuality. And it's something we haven't talked about, but I've written a lot about. There are now children's books, really, that would make a drunken sailor blush, put it that way. Ways of, intimate contact with young people, teaching them 4 or 5 different ways to do things. I won't go into the detail, but it's appalling that there's no sense of the intimacy, almost the holiness, the intimacy of the love between a man and a woman or a boy and a girl, that sense, the precious, intimate relationship that you can establish. And that's part of the push to destroy the family. Because if young people have no sense of that, what I call godliness, then if anything's possible in a relationship, if you can be whatever gender you want, you can do whatever you want, then there are no borders, no boundaries. No. There's no sense of a moral guideline. And we're getting into all kinds of dangerous territory there. And
it's the deep sexualization of our young ones. We've been fighting the group that is behind Family Matters, called Family First, not a political party, but an advocacy group, has long tried to expose, probably a bad pun, what's actually being given to children, particularly around sex and sexuality education, primary school children, exactly what you just described, Kevin, explicit materials. And one can't help think, or maybe I should personalize it, I can't help think it is trying to sexualize people younger and younger, and therefore normalize those behaviors. And again, a big part of it does seem also to try and pull the parent away. The basic, if I could put it crudely, the idea the child is not owned, if you will, probably the wrong word, but is not of the parents. The child is merely another addition to the state. And so the state will control what they see and learn. Hence, the parents are isolated from these decisions. I think it's just an
Mm.
appalling breach of the social contract.
You know, I've argued for many years, and it's a bit of a cliche, I suppose, but parents are their children's primary educators. Parents are their children's primary educators and moral guardians. And that's why so many parents I'm now meeting and dealing with around Australia are starting their own schools, because they've realised, and we all know as a parent, the most precious gift we can have is to have children. And we bear the responsibility to raise them and to give them that foundation in life, that sense of human flourishing, of what is good and evil, that sense of how to best. And it goes back to and this is why the classical schools are so good, it goes back to the ancient Greeks and the idea of the virtues. And, you know, we could talk a lot about this. I've written, and we've had some very good speeches. I'll send you the links to the
Please.
forums we've had, and your viewers might want to have a look at this. There was a very good speech by Paul Morrissey, who heads up Campion College in Sydney, which is a liberal arts college in the American form. Virtues, truth, justice, love, courage. I mean, if you're not imbued with that from a very early age, it's almost impossible to cope with life and to find that sense of flourishing and fulfillment and resilience. And I think that's why it's so crucial that parents are intimately involved with what is going on with their child's education.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'd add, again, it's only from my perspective, is actually by parents being allowed to bring up their children in that moral, academic, ethical, cultural front, it actually allows that breadth which we already have in society. In other words, if each family is responsible, then, you know, there is going to be a diversity in the best sense of the word, rather than this monological attempt through activists to form every child in only one certain way. You must think about things in this way. Where there's actually, there is a natural breadth in our humanity. We do have different perspectives, which is why traditionally we've allowed parents to be, as you say, the primary guide, and the state to stay out of it. And this is why it doesn't matter if it's Jacinda Ardern or Dan Andrews there in Victoria or overseas, more and more politicians, more and more activists trying to get into that family unit and dictate what can be said, thought and believed in.
Definitely true. And the other point here I'm beginning to hear, what schools are sometimes doing now is abrogating their responsibility. So what they're doing are bringing in supposed experts from outside the school to teach the children, especially in areas like gender and sexuality, diversity and difference. And some of this has become public, and it's very appalling. You know, one school in Sydney, I think it was, the people who'd been paid to come into the school to teach a program to 12, 13-year-old children put up on the screen very explicit images of sexual activity. And the parents were aghast. They were shocked, because the 10, 12-year-old children came home and said, "Mum, Dad, what does that mean?" Or, "Do people do that?" So the other question here is, it's not just parents and teachers and schools being involved in being guardians. We also need to look at the outside groups that are becoming more active in getting into schools.
And maybe that's sort of the place to wrap things up, because I'm conscious of taking a lot of your time, is really an encouragement, and feel free to critique or add to this, but certainly from my view, or perspective, it's encouraging parents to be as involved as they can in their kids' education, understand what is being taught, who is coming into the school, ask for those books and curricula so that they can actually get ahead of the game. And you know what, to be blunt, where possible, pull your kids out, because actually some of the stuff, certainly in New Zealand state schools, deeply, deeply worrying.
True. Very true.
Kevin, I am exceptionally grateful for your time. As I said at the start, you are a prolific author and commentator, and exceptionally well respected. And I'm just so pleased with all the commitments you have, that you took the time to come and chat with us. And I suspect we'll need to talk again because we've only touched the tip of the iceberg on these topics. But thank you again for being part of the podcast and show.
Absolutely a pleasure. And I mentioned to you, Simon, I've been everywhere in New Zealand, from Invercargill to up north to the Bay of Islands, Auckland, Wellington, New Plymouth. I think New Zealand's a fabulous place, especially the wine and the food.
Yep.
And I hope, it went through a dark period with Ardern. I just hope that, you're able to rebuild that. And one of the things that troubles me in the West, we need to rebuild that sense of national unity, national purpose, social stability. And, Peter Dutton, the leader of the opposition here, made a very good speech where the current government has 3 flags. Whenever the Prime Minister talks, who's Labor, there's Torres Strait Islander, Aboriginal. The Australian flag is somewhere on the left where you can hardly see it. But Peter Dutton said, well, we should have one flag, the Australian flag, because we are one nation and we can have different communities, different ethnic, racial groups, different religions, but we all come together under that umbrella of a Western liberal democracy, and we must defend and acknowledge the benefits of that, because you only have to look north to China, to North Korea, even further to Russia and to Iran. Millions and millions of people live oppressed, poor, suffering. We should really safeguard what we have.
Absolutely, as I've sometimes debated with people, that we'll only realise that the patrimony or the tradition that we've inherited once we've lost it. And I prefer that we didn't. Hey, Kevin, thanks again. It was just lovely to have you on the show.
My pleasure.